Welcome back to Axis of Truth. There's a ceasefire, sort of, and yes, the job clearly isn't done in Lebanon or in Iran, but this week I want to zoom out a little bit more while we watch what President Trump's next move is and expose the ongoing horrific methods of sexual violence the IRGC and the Islamic regime proxies are using to terrorize the people across this region, from Gaza to Tehran. But first, let's talk about the Iran moral test, which the global left is failing in real time. Now, for decades, the left has marketed itself as some kind of moral authority on human rights, the side that claims to care more, to see more, to fight harder for vulnerable people, the party of women, of gays, of immigrants, of civil rights, and opposing police brutality and the death penalty. I don't want to hear ever again any of these things, because the Iran test exposes that this isn't a universal value system, it's a selective one. Look at how the left talks about immigration or police brutality in the United States. They'll spend years defending people who break the law, framing it as a moral issue, a human issue. They'll organize, protest, and scream about police brutality and ICE from the rooftops, but if Iranian children are shot in the streets by the IRGC snipers for protesting, suddenly it's not our problem. It's not our war. At least 1,639 executions in 2025, the highest number since 1989. More than 90% of those were not even announced by the regime. Hundreds more executions already in 2026. Tens of thousands killed in protests over the years, more than 50,000 people currently detained, many of them facing execution for protesting. By the left's own framework, this should be the largest human rights story in the world, but it isn't. Let's look at women's rights. We're constantly told by the left to believe women, and we should. Meanwhile, in Iran, women live under a gender apartheid system. They're beaten, detained, or killed for non-compliance. And when they protest, they're not posting hashtags. They're risking torture, sexual violence, which we'll talk about, and execution. And yet, when sexual violence is used by the regime and its proxies as a tool of control and war, those women disappear from the left's agenda because Trump or Bibi or whatever excuse they have today. And look at LGBTQ rights. The left says that this is non-negotiable, but in Iran, being gay is punishable by death. Men are hanged from cranes. Meanwhile, on the left, you have gay men like Glenn Greenwald, who have parroted regime propaganda for years, aiding those who would execute him in the information war. So no, I don't want to hear another lecture about humanity from people who pick and choose which humans count. Sadly, this has become policy for the left and not just rhetoric. Of course, we have Jimmy Carter, who helped abandon the Shah and open the door to Khomeini in '79. We have Barack Obama, who sold the nuclear deal as a way to moderate the regime, unlocking tens of billions of dollars in accessible funds. And the promise was that economic relief would change behavior. But it didn't. It funded expansion. And then under Biden, of course, sanctions remained on paper, but were relaxed in practice. The regime generated well over $100 billion in oil revenue alone between 2021 and 2024, which literally financially revived the regime. And what did that revival produce? More repression at home, more executions, more crackdowns, and more violence abroad through Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and all the terror proxies across the region. And now, on top of the ridiculous policies from Democratic administrations, you also have something even worse coming from the left today. You have people like Senators Chris Murphy and Bernie Sanders, or pundits like Cenk Uygur and Mehdi Hassan, not just ignoring these crimes, but actively repeating the talking points of the regime responsible for them, claiming the United States is losing, claiming Israel forced America into this war, which we'll talk about, stripping the regime of responsibility while stripping Iranians of any kind of sympathy. It isn't analysis, it's propaganda. And at this point, the pattern is very clear, just like with the Palestinian cause. It's not about human rights, it's not about progressive values, and it's not even about the people they claim to defend. Because if it were, Iranians would be at the center of this conversation, and they aren't. What this is really about is opposition to America and its allies, no matter the cost. Even if that cost is ignoring executions and ignoring sexual violence, ignoring gay men being hanged from cranes, ignoring children being shot in the street. I will never again take lectures from these people about humanity. Iran is the moral test today, and the left didn't just fail it, it's exposed itself. And now on to the disaster that we avoided, Kamala Harris. Now, for the past few weeks, a narrative has been pushed with a straight face that should have been laughed out of any serious discussion, and instead it's being repeated by politicians and commentators and people who really should know better, which is the claim that the United States didn't make an independent decision in this conflict, but was somehow dragged into it by Israel, including folks like Kamala Harris. But this argument only works if you simultaneously remove agency from both the United States and from the Islamic Republic, because it requires you to believe that the President of the United States cannot act without Israel's permission, while also believing that a regime which has spent decades building, funding, and directing proxy terror warfare across the region is just passively responding to events. Take a look at this.
He entered a war, got pulled into it by Bibi Netanyahu, let's be clear about that, entered a war that the American people do not want, putting at risk American service members.
It's still painful to even listen to this woman talk because she's so insanely stupid. But, what we just heard was not really any kind of serious attempt to grapple with the reality of the conflict. Not that she would understand it anyway, but because the entire purpose of these kinds of statements is to shift the center of gravity away from the Islamic Republic and instead place it on Israel, so that the regime driving the instability, the Islamic Republic, disappears into the background while Israel becomes the primary actor in this story. And once you understand that shift, everything else follows much more quickly. It's why then you hear the second claim that we're hearing from a lot of people now, that the United States is somehow being dragged into war, as if American policy isn't being shaped by American interest, but by external pressure. And we've heard this from people like Kamala Harris, but we also hear it from political scientists like John Mearsheimer, who's had a weird obsession with Israel for many years, and even members of Congress like Ilhan Omar, who openly incite against the U.S. president in order to smear Israel. Take a look at what Mearsheimer had to say.
I mean, that New York Times story the other day is guaranteed to make it clear to huge numbers of Americans that the Israelis led us by the nose into this war. And there were all sorts of people in the national security establishment who were flashing orange lights, if not a red light. But why did we go? Because the Israelis convinced President Trump that it was a good idea, that they had a workable strategy.
I mean, the good news is that Mearsheimer was wrong about almost every single one of his predictions. So the fact that he's saying this like it's a bad thing is like a great indicator that, in fact, it is the right policy and the right thing to do. But we also heard this stupidity from people like John Kerry, who was very quick to blame Netanyahu when, in fact, Netanyahu wasn't even the prime minister of Israel at the time that Bush was president. But take a look at what he had to say this week.
Yes, he wanted us to strike. He came to President Obama. He made a presentation to ask to strike. President Obama refused. President Biden refused. President Bush refused. The only president who has agreed to this, obviously, is President Trump.
I mean, this is someone who has a long track record of flat out lying, so it's not really surprising. I mean, who cares about facts, right, John Kerry? But we'll just forget the fact that it's the actual exact same argument that the Islamic regime officials, the remaining ones, are making themselves, right? I mean, we have Ghalibaf here. Take a look.
همینطور در طراحی نظامیشون هم اشتباه میکنن. اون بحثی که من هشتگی که میگفتم الان این دولت مدعی اول آمریکا ولی در عمل عملاً شده اول اسرائیل چون با اطلاعات غلط او با طراحی او تصمیم میگیرن.
In both cases, the story is that Israel acts and America, for whatever reason, follows, and then Iran just reacts to the situation, which, of course, is not a description of reality, but a deliberate frame that happens to align perfectly with the way that the Islamic Republic itself has described this conflict for years. Because Iran's own leaders have repeatedly claimed that U.S. actions are about saving Israel, that America isn't acting as a sovereign power, but as an extension of Israeli interests. And that's what this is really the whole narrative of this is not America's war. That's what this is all about. And they're not even hiding that message. I mean, they're exporting it. The fact that you're now hearing different versions of that same argument from both the left and the right in America that's sort of cleaned up and sanitized for a Western audience should immediately raise suspicion about whose frame is actually being repeated with these arguments. Now, most importantly, because this whole argument kind of falls apart the second that you look at the actual record, because Donald Trump's position on Iran didn't emerge last week. It didn't emerge during this war, and it didn't emerge because of Israel. It's a through line that goes back decades and is documented in his own words and actions. Take a look at what he said in 1980.
When you get the respect of the other countries, then the other countries tend to do a little bit as you do, and you can create the right attitudes. The Iranian situation is a case in point. That they hold our hostages is just absolutely and totally ridiculous. That this country sits back and allows a country such as Iran to hold our hostages, to my way of thinking, is a horror. And I don't think they'd do it with other countries. I honestly don't think they'd do it with other countries.
Obviously, you're advocating that we should have gone in there with troops, etc., and brought our boys out.
I absolutely feel that, yes. I don't think there's any question, and there's no question in my mind. I think right now would be an oil-rich nation, and I believe that we should have done it, and I'm very disappointed that we didn't do it, and I don't think anybody would have held us in abeyance. I don't think anybody would have been angry with us, and we had every right to do it at the time. I think we've lost the opportunity.
So in 1980, during the hostage crisis, this is how now President Trump described the situation with the regime as ridiculous, arguing that the United States should have acted forcefully and framing the regime as that direct challenge to American power. This isn't a new position for President Trump, and it's certainly not one that can be attributed to current events or Israeli influence. But there's actually a lot more. Let's fast forward to 1987 in another interview with Trump.
I'm here because I'm personally tired of seeing this great country of ours being ripped off.
But as far as Trump is concerned, our allies are only part of the problem. The real culprit is Iran.
Why couldn't we go in and take over some of their oil, which is along the sea?
How would you do that? Would you send in the Marines? Would you take a chance in a war?
Let them have Iran. You take their oil. That's what
How?
How?
I mean, do we want a war? What do you mean we take their oil?
You go in. You're
How
have
do
a
we
war,
go
Barbara.
in?
You're going to have a war by being weak.
Okay, how do we go in? What do we do?
Excuse me.
Yeah.
You're going to have a war, and it's going to start in the Middle East.
What if the Soviet Union said, you do this to Iran, we're going to come in?
I don't believe they'd do it. The next time Iran attacks this country, go in and grab one of their big oil installations, and I mean grab it and keep it, and get back your losses, because this country has lost plenty because of Iran.
Well, there you have it. And by those late 1980s, Trump again reiterated his call to do a number on Khag Island and continued to have a zero-tolerance approach to the regime's anti-American aggression. And this is something that's continued over the years through his criticism of the JCPOA, the Iran deal under Obama. Take a look.
This was just prior to the signing of the Iran deal, which gave back to Iran $150 billion and gave us absolutely nothing. It will go down in history as one of the worst deals ever negotiated. The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it, believe me.
So by 2015, he was already calling that nuclear deal the worst deal ever negotiated, as you heard, not because somebody told him to say that, but because it fits with the position that he already had been articulating for decades. And then in 2018, he finally acted on that position by withdrawing from the deal. And in 2020, he authorized the strike on Qasem Soleimani, who was the head of the IRGC and one of the most significant direct actions taken against the Islamic Republic in decades. This was clearly a decision made by the United States based on its own strategic calculations. He has a 4-decade record of consistent positioning, which means that the claim that he was suddenly pushed into this by Israel is not just wrong, but requires you to ignore the entire public record of President Trump. And it also requires you to ignore the Islamic regime's actions, because in this frame, the regime is always reacting and never driving the events, which is absurd given that this is a regime that has spent billions building up Hezbollah, funding Hamas, arming militias in Iraq, backing the Houthis, and investing for decades in proxy warfare as a core strategic doctrine that's designed to project power without the responsibility of direct confrontation. This isn't reactive behavior, it's initiative, it's expansionist, and it's included direct attacks on Americans, including the 1983 bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut. That was done by Hezbollah, an Islamic regime-backed proxy terror group, which killed 241 American service members and remains one of the deadliest attacks on U.S. forces in history. There's a long and well-documented history of Iranian regime forces killing Americans, which makes the claim that the United States has no independent interest in confronting this regime not just weak, but totally detached from reality. In fact, if Israel actually controlled U.S. policy, we wouldn't see disagreements between Washington and Jerusalem, and we wouldn't see the United States at times attempting to limit Israeli operations, as we just saw President Trump do with his comments about Lebanon, with the friction that regularly plays out between the two governments. So you're now with a claim that cannot possibly be true by all available evidence, which is that Israel controls the United States, or that Trump's decisions about what's best for Israel, or are based on what's best for Israel, not what's best for America. And this is a narrative that requires you to go ignore 40 years of Trump's own record. It's not a bad take or misreading of events, but a frame that mirrors the propaganda of the regime itself, which, let's be honest, has always sought to present itself as a reactive party in this conflict and present the United States as manipulated, and present Israel as the primary driver of the conflict, despite the fact that that's demonstrably false, as we see with what's happening in the Middle East today. Now, the reality is when you repeat that frame, you're not analyzing the war, you're reinforcing the very narrative, Kamala, that the regime itself is trying to export, and implying that that 40-year track record that President Trump has is somehow related to Benjamin Netanyahu, a figure that Trump didn't even know at the time. It doesn't add up. Well, next up, we have two stories that broke this week that really cut through all the noise and force you to look directly at how this regime and its proxies actually operate, not just in theory, of course, or in talking points, but in a brutal and very, very personal way. The first is the case of Salehi Akbari, a 38-year-old nurse, operating room technician, and a mountaineer from Ardabil, who, together with her husband, Ahmed Khorai, had been helping protesters during the recent uprising, which is actually ended up being why they were targeted in the first place when security forces raided their home. Now, what happened next wasn't just a killing, it was a deliberate act of terror that was designed to break them and to send a message far beyond their family, because when she tried to protect her husband during the raid of the IRGC, she was actually shot and killed. And that should have been the end of it, the tragic end, but it wasn't. According to reporting that's been circulating widely now, including coverage from Iran International, security forces didn't just kill her, they recorded what they did afterwards in the morgue and sent it directly to her husband, a video showing the IRGC forces sexually abusing her body. Take a look at what Ahmed had to say.
من خجالت میکشم پیامشون رو بفرستم. یه پیام داده به میخواستن که گوشیش رو باز کنن، گوشیش اثر انگشتی بوده. میرن سردخونه، اونجا انگشتش رو بزنن به گوشی رو باز کنن. میدونین چه پیامی به من داده؟ میگه فلان جای خانومتو گرفته بودم دستم. بعد عکس میفرسته برا من. من با این غم چطور کنار بیام؟ من با این ببینید شکنجه روحی که من الان دارم میشم از اون شکنجه هایی که تو زندان شدم، دندم شکست، کلیم آسیب دید، به خدا اونها خیلی خوبه.
When you listen to him speak about that, you're hearing a man describing how the people who killed his wife made sure that her death wouldn't be the end of his suffering, but the beginning of it by turning her body into a weapon against him and forcing him to watch, making sure that what they did to her would live in his head permanently. And it did, because after being subjected to that level of deliberate psychological torture, after being forced to watch that footage, and after being left with no justice and no accountability or way to escape what had been done to his wife, Ahmed Khodai couldn't live with it and took his own life yesterday. Now, the full story isn't just that the Islamic regime forces killed her, but that they also destroyed him too in the process. And sexual violence has long been a known tactic of the Islamic regime. It's used in detention centers, during interrogations, and in crackdowns on protesters as a way to humiliate or control and deter anyone else from following the same path. And in this case, they did not just use it against the person that they killed, they extended it to the person that she loved, turning her body into a tool of psychological warfare. Now, the worst part of this is that this isn't an isolated case. Multiple international bodies have documented that the Islamic regime has systematically used sexual violence as a tool of repression. The UN fact-finding mission on Iran concluded that rape and other forms of sexual violence were used during the Women Like Freedom protests as part of a widespread and systematic crackdown, including against women, men, and even minors in detention. Amnesty International has also documented cases of gang rape, electric shocks to genitals, and sexual torture during interrogations, describing it as a deliberate strategy to punish, humiliate, and extract confessions. Human Rights Watch as well as other human rights groups, have reported the same pattern where sexual violence isn't incidental but institutional. It's used by security forces as a method of control. And when you put that record next to what happened to Salehi Akbari and Ahmed Khodai, you're not looking at a deviation from the system. You're looking at the system functioning exactly as it was designed. And the point isn't to silence the individual, but to send a message to everyone else that if you help the protesters, if you resist, if you step out of line, this is what will happen to you and to the people you love. And that message doesn't even end with death. It continues afterwards in the form of humiliation, trauma, and fear. And while that's happening inside of Iran, we also saw this week a parallel story emerging out of Gaza that shows the exact same logic of power and the same exploitation of vulnerability. The Daily Mail reported this week that women in Gaza, particularly widows and divorcees who have been displaced, cut off from stable income, and left dependent on aid distribution networks for survival, are being sexually exploited by Hamas or by other men operating with them who control access to food parcels, humanitarian aid, cash payments, and even the ability to move or find shelter. They're using that control to coerce women into sexual relationships under conditions where refusal can mean hunger, homelessness, or worse. These are detailed testimonies, including a man who described a widow being found inside a tent in the Garabli area while being assaulted by multiple Qassam forces members, and another who said that women were being forced to sell themselves for food or small amounts of cash, sometimes as little as 100 shekels, which tells you the level of desperation and the scale of the power imbalance. The report also describes how these interactions are often initiated through charity channels or religious organizations where women apply for assistance and then find themselves targeted by men who have access to their personal information, including phone numbers, and who use that access to begin harassment, pressure, and eventual coercion. Now, one woman identified as Noor, a displaced and divorced mother of 4, described how a man working through an Islamic charity contacted her after she sought help, continued to harass her, and then made it clear that she could not report him or resist him, telling her directly, "You can't expose me. I am the government here." Now, these kinds of statements are the entire structure of abuse under Hamas and all the proxies of the Islamic regime in Iran, because it reveals a system in which the same people who control resources, security, and daily life also operate with complete impunity, and where women who have already lost everything are left with no real choice but to navigate that power dynamic in order to survive. When you look at these two stories together, you see that pattern that isn't subtle, because in Iran, you have a state that uses sexual violence as a tool of repression, as psychological warfare. And in Gaza, you have a proxy terror group, which does exactly the same. Now, this isn't about those isolated incidents or even a few bad actors. It's about the systems that enable this behavior and a culture that normalizes it. And that is exactly why the constant attempt to draw a moral equivalence between Israel and these actors isn't just lazy, but it's actually an insult to people who are living under them, because there's a fundamental difference between a democracy fighting a war and regimes or organizations that use rape, humiliation, and coercion as tools of power. And if you can't see that difference, then your human rights framework is not just inconsistent, it's completely disconnected from reality. And with that, let's get to the good, the bad, and the ugly stories of this week. The bad this week is something that we've been warning about for months, and it's happening in real time, which is the escalation of targeted attacks on Jewish institutions outside of Israel. It's not random and it's not isolated. There's now a group that has actually claimed responsibility for multiple attacks, and that is a group calling itself Harakat Ashab al-Yamin al-Islamiyya, which has emerged in recent weeks and is now being investigated, at least by European authorities, as a possible Iranian-linked proxy terror group. Now, just this week, there was an attempted arson attack on Kenton United Synagogue in northwest London, where an accelerant was thrown into the building, causing fire and smoke damage. And this wasn't isolated. As I mentioned, it's part of a series of attacks that are now being described as a sustained campaign of violence and intimidation against the Jewish community. Now, that same group has claimed responsibility for other attacks in the same time frame, including the firebombing of a Jewish community ambulance, two of them actually, in Golders Green, where multiple vehicles from Hatzalah were set on fire outside a synagogue using accelerants, similar tactics, causing explosions and destroying critical emergency equipment. Now, they've also been linked to attempted arson attacks and synagogues in Finchley and in Hendon, and to an attack on the Persian language media outlet, Iran International, critical of the Iranian regime, which should tell you that this isn't just about random targets, but about a network of symbolic targets connected to Jewish life, Israel, and the Iranian opposition. Now, this doesn't just stop in London, because the same group has also claimed attacks across Europe, including incidents in Belgium and the Netherlands targeting synagogues as well as Jewish sites, which is why authorities are now looking at this as a transnational pattern rather than a localized series of incidents. And this is where people continue to underestimate what's happening, because they want to frame this as disorganized hate or spontaneous outrage, a few bad actors, when in reality, what you're looking at is the kind of environment that allows networks, proxies, and influence operations to take root, where incitement has been normalized for years and where it only takes a small number of actors to turn that incitement into real-world violence. Because when you have synagogues being firebombed or ambulances being set on fire, media outlets being targeted, and all of it happening within days of each other, it's not just a security issue, it's a signal that what's been brewing under the surface for years through propaganda and incitement and networks that have been allowed to operate with very little scrutiny is now materializing into direct attacks on Jewish communities. And there's no context that justifies firebombing a synagogue. There's no context that justifies setting fire to ambulances. And there's certainly no context that justifies a sustained campaign of intimidation against a community based on who they are. And now for the ugly story of the week is how fast a completely unsubstantiated, almost laughable claim came to be turned into a global narrative. This claim that Israeli forces used dogs to sexually assault Palestinians, I can't believe I'm even saying this, started with the Hamas-associated Euromed Human Rights Monitor, which provided, of course, zero hard evidence for one of the most extreme accusations you can make. And then the Hamas fan club, Dropsite News, ran with it as if it were fact, even laundering it through what they implied was an Israeli intel source, except that Israeli source was not intelligence, not government, and not connected to the state in any way. It was an activist commentator who was openly anti-Israel and who was simply repeating the same claim and presenting it as some kind of confirmation. It wasn't a mistake on his part. It's a deliberate attempt to mislead and to give a baseless story a false sense of credibility. And when you actually look at the claim itself, it obviously falls apart because it's not just unproven, it's functionally impossible because it relies on, first of all, the testimonies. They're completely unverified and they rely on zero evidence. I mean, the prisoners who are claiming that at State Taiman that they were raped by the IDF dogs because they were instructed and trained by the IDF to do that, and it doesn't even make sense in the stories. And it doesn't make sense even more so because military dogs are trained through conditioning and repetition and reward systems to perform highly specific tasks like detection, tracking, or controlled apprehension, which require precision and reliability, but not like random or unpredictable behavior. There's no training framework anywhere in the world for dogs that conditions an animal for sexual action on command, because that's not a behavior that you can standardize, control, or deploy in an operational setting. So anyone with even basic knowledge of working with dog programs knows that immediately. So what you're left with is this ridiculous claim that has no evidence and that doesn't even pass a basic reality check. But I actually went one step further because I spoke to a soldier who served in State Taiman in the past few months, in the past few years, and asked him about this exactly. And his response was very simple, and I quote, "That is retarded. How do you use an animal to rape a person? That's not true." So there you have it. That's the level of seriousness that this deserves, because this isn't investigative journalism. This is a propaganda pipeline where a non-credible, almost laughable claim gets published, picked up, amplified, and then dressed up with fake authority until it looks real enough for people to believe it. And by the time anybody asks for evidence, it's already spread everywhere. And the damage here is not just that people are being misled, it's that you're taking one of the most serious crimes that exists and turning it into a political weapon, which of course undermines real victims and real cases by flooding the space with claims that cannot ever be proven and were never proven to begin with. So the actual story is not what they are saying happened. The actual story is how easy it's become to manufacture a bogus story like this and push it into the system and have it treated as fact without ever meeting the most basic standard of evidence. And last but not least, the good this week is not that anything has been fixed, it's that the hypocrisy is so obvious you don't even have to point it out anymore. Because this week, Candace Owens, who has spent months amplifying some of the most toxic anti-Jewish and anti-Israel rhetoric online, is now being sued for defamation over false claims about Brigitte Macron. And suddenly everything gets very real. Because it's not just the fact that she's being sued, it's who she turned to the second there were actual consequences. Now, Laura Loomer actually revealed this week that her legal defense, Candace's legal defense, is being handled by Kasowitz Benson Torres, a major New York law firm deeply embedded in the very legal and political establishment that she pretends to stand against. A firm where David Friedman was a partner before serving as the U.S. ambassador to Israel. Yes, Candace hired a Zionist Jewish lawyer to represent her. And let's just be clear about what this looks like. Candace, you spend months pushing rhetoric that targets Jewish communities, questioning loyalties, amplifying narratives that feed directly into hostile anti-America, by the way, propaganda, calling Jews the synagogue of Satan. Yet the second you're sued for defamation, the second there's actual accountability for the things you say, you run straight to one of the most established firms in the country, a firm built inside the exact Zionist world that you claim to expose. Really? And let's not forget that this same firm is also one that's been closely connected to defending Israel and Jewish interest in high-level legal and political spaces. This is an irony, it's complete collapse. Because if you actually believed the things you were saying, Candace, you wouldn't be relying on the very structures that you spend your time attacking. And you would certainly not be relying on a legal ecosystem built by the same world that you claim to oppose. But the second it's your reputation and your liability, your future on the line, all of that disappears and you go exactly where everyone else goes, to the best lawyers you can find. And that's the good this week, not because anything has changed with this awful woman, but because the mask is completely off and there's no way anymore to pretend otherwise. And with that, we wrap up for this week, but we'll be back next week with more stories of what's actually happening across this region and how the war against the Islamic Republic is shaping up, if there will still be a ceasefire. As always, if there's a story you think we should cover, you can reach me on social media at Emily K. Schrader or on Instagram at Emily in Tel Aviv. And I'll see you next week here on JNS with Axis of Truth.